We've looked at our responsibility as creation priests with the information we've learned about the biomatrix and biogeochemical cycles. What about our responsibility as kings of the creation? Here we begin with the claim that I would make that we should preserve the bodies, our bodies' biomatrix. I've spoken about the biomatrix being a world of unseen organisms all around the world. That includes in our own bodies. We have a bunch of microorganisms inside our bodies. How many species we don't even know, but we suspect it's in the many thousands, if not even perhaps millions, of different organisms are in fact living in our bodies, most of which are probably necessary or at least not doing us any harm. We've got a lot to learn about these organisms, but we need to understand that God created those organisms to be in our bodies, and we shouldn't be compromising or destroying those organisms. So, for example, we shouldn't sterilize our bodies. There are some folks in the world who feel, because they're afraid of organisms that might harm them, that they need to wash themselves excessively. They need to keep sterilizing themselves. But when you do that, there's a point at which you're doing harm to your body. I referred to the microorganisms that are living on your skin that actually function as your first line of defense against organisms that are invading. If you clean yourself excessively, not only do you thin your skin and compromise that particular line of defense, but you kill the organisms that in fact are protecting you. If you sterilize your body too much, you in fact make yourself more susceptible to organisms that might invade. Secondly, do not take antibiotics preventatively. Some people think that, well, if I have to take antibiotics whenever I get ill, then maybe I should take antibiotics more frequently than that to prevent getting sick, so that I don't get sick. If antibiotics kill off the critters that are doing me harm once they're in there, maybe I can keep them from getting in there by taking antibiotics. I've encountered a number of people who take that perspective. So they try to get antibiotics and put them into their body even when they're not sick to prevent getting sick. Turns out this is counterproductive. This is something that actually makes you more susceptible to disease, because you've got organisms not just on the surface of your body, but inside your mouth, inside your intestines, throughout the interior of your body. Their function really is to help you in a variety of ways, and included there is to fend off the organisms that are invading your body. If in fact you take antibiotics, which are actually designed to be against bios, life, they're going to kill not just the bad guys, they're going to kill the good guys. They're going to kill the biomatrix that's supposed to be there and some of your own cells, thus actually reducing your ability to fend off the organisms that are invading. It is not a good idea to take antibiotics preventatively. You need to avoid that altogether. You take antibiotics, you kill life only when it is necessary to do so, only when killing a particular organism that's killing you actually results in your survival. Secondly, we should preserve the planet's biomatrix. Besides preserving our own body's biomatrix, we should do what we can to make sure we don't destroy the biomatrix God created across the planet. For example, we should not pollute. We have actually looked at this in a variety of ways, variety of perspectives. We don't pollute to destroy beauty. We don't pollute in this particular case to destroy the biomatrix. In this particular case, we can define pollution as putting too much of something into the world that the biomatrix is designed to take out. Remember, the biomatrix's function is to decompose things that need decomposing, is to make unpoisonous those things that are poisonous, and so on and so forth. That's its function. When we put too many things into the environment that the biomatrix can't handle. We put too many poisons into the environment or put them in at too great a rate that the biomatrix organisms can't make them unharmful. That's polluting. When we put too many things into the environment that can't be, too many things to be, for the biomatrix to decompose, we are polluting. So the biomatrix is designed for a particular function. If we overload that function, that's what we consider pollution. We need to consider also, when we consider this issue of biopollution, the fact that some organisms are more susceptible to poisons than other organisms. There's some organisms in the world, for example, that accumulate poisons that other organisms just kick out of their bodies. These organisms we call bioaccumulators, organisms that can pick up mercury, for example. They might pick up a little bit today and a little bit next week and a little bit in a year from now. They don't have a mechanism to get rid of it, so it just accumulates in their body. They're bioaccumulators, and eventually it gets to the point where it does them harm. Those particular organisms are the ones that are most susceptible to pollution. The other organisms of the environment might not actually show it, so when you're polluting the environment, you might not see it in 90% of the organisms that live in that particular locality. You're only going to see it in really the bioaccumulators. That's where you'll see it. We need to be aware of the organisms that are the bioaccumulators and watch them. They would be our first indicators that in fact we're doing something to pollute the environment. But in addition to bioaccumulators, there's also another effect that's important to understand here, something called biological magnification. This is where bioaccumulators that are higher in the food chain are at even greater risk. Let's say you have a bioaccumulator who is, that's a plant. They're accumulating dangerous material, and eventually the plant is not only in danger, but the things that eat the plant are also going to be poisoned by that accumulation. But let's say the one that eats the plant is also a bioaccumulator. That organism is going to collect everything the plant accumulated, plus everything that everything else it eats accumulated, and it's going to have even more poison accumulated in its body than anyone else. In fact, if you have let's say the highest predator, the eagles of an environment are bioaccumulators, and every organism that they eat and every organism that those organisms eat are bioaccumulators, there's going to be a higher concentration of poison the higher you go up the food chain. This means that very often the highest predators in an environment, the organisms that have no other predators above them, but they predate on those things that are beneath them, they are the ones that probably will show the evidence of pollution first of all. Examples in this category of instances where pollution has been a problem in the past would include acid rain. Acid rain is a phenomenon where rain falling down from the sky is more acidic than it is supposed to be. We have to acknowledge that rain usually is acidic. When water drops through the air, it picks up carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide dissolves into the water droplet, because there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When carbon dioxide is in water, dissolved in water, it produces hydrochloric acid. Very, very weak hydrochloric acid, but nonetheless, it makes the water a bit acidic. By the time the water lands on the earth, by the time rain lands on the earth, it is just slightly acidic. It's got the carbonic acid that you find in a little bit of the acid that you find in a soft drink, for example. It's not as strong as a soft drink acidity, but a little bit. Acid rain is more acidic than that. So normal acidity is what you would expect in any time. But what we do when we burn coal, for example, there's sulfur in coal. That sulfur is thrown out of the smokestacks of coal burning plants as sulfur oxides. Sulfur oxides are dust particles in the atmosphere. When water dropping down in the form of droplets encounters sulfur oxides, the sulfur oxide plus the water makes sulfuric acid. And that makes the water falling down much more acidic than the carbon dioxide does. Also, nitrogen is another problem in the atmosphere. When nitrates in the soil find their way into the atmosphere as dust, those are nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen oxides combining with water produce nitric acid. Nitric acid, sulfuric acid, carbonic acid, they add together to make increasingly acidic water. So when we burn fossil fuels, when we burn coal, when we burn oil, when we burn gasoline in our cars, it puts dust in the atmosphere that makes rain more acidic. The result of acid rain is that if it's acidic enough, it goes into lakes and increases the acidity in those lakes and kills fish. So at one point, the coal-burning plants in the south part of Michigan and around Chicago and so on was blown across the eastern part of the United States and poisoned more than 200 lakes in the Adirondacks, killing fish in over 200 lakes in the Adirondacks. Also, the acid rain comes down and burns the leaves of trees and sometimes defoliates them, takes off the leaves altogether. It also lands in the soil and works with the chemistry of the soil to pull out nutrients that the plant actually needs to survive. And it also adds, in some cases, ions that are poisonous to the soil. As a result, at the same time the Adirondack lakes were being poisoned, trees in the Smoky Mountains were being defoliated and compromised in this. A lot of trees were dying in the Smokies. As a response to this, when people began to realize that the pollution of the atmosphere was causing these problems, they began putting filters on the smokestacks of the coal-burning plants, increased filtering devices on cars, automobiles, to prevent that dust from the nitrogen oxides and the sulfur oxides from getting out into the atmosphere. The result of that was actually to drop the amount of acid rain that actually occurred, and eventually we recovered most of the Adirondack lakes with their fish and recovered the trees in the Smokies. A very exciting, positive example where humans said, ooh, we observe that we are in fact poisoning the environment. There is a way to respond to this. Now I know this made people upset because it made it more expensive to burn coal. It made it more expensive to create cars because we've got to filter this stuff away. And so people didn't like this. But it's our responsibility to preserve His creation, to compromise a little bit of the money we make, the excessive money we make, to invest in making sure we do not destroy God's creation. Another example of pollution is non-biodegradable trash. We have a bunch of trash in our world. We're increasingly throwing things away, and we put it into landfills, for example. Well, the Biomatrix is designed to take things we throw away and break them down into the necessary components. In fact, components that can be used as nutrients for other organisms. This is wonderful stuff. But in many cases, we produce trash at a larger rate or a faster rate than the Biomatrix is able to decompose it. And we've actually created substances, brand new unnatural substances, that there's nothing in the Biomatrix designed to break down. So we've produced plastic, for example. Well, plastic is not in the natural world. there's no biomatrix organism out there, or so it seems, that can break down plastic. So we throw the plastic into our landfills, and the plastic remains there for long, long periods of time. We produce nylon and Teflon, and we produce all sorts of substances that have never been seen on this planet before. So it stands to reason there's probably no biomatrix organism designed to break it down. So it just accumulates in our landfills and so on. We produced nylon in 1935, and so these things have been accumulating for decades. What do we do with this? And by the way, this then is consumed sometimes by animals, ends up in the stomachs of animals. There's nothing inside the animal, there's no biomatrix organism inside the animal that can break it down. Remember once when I was at on a beach in South Carolina, a big storm was occurring. Among other things, a shark was tossed up on the beach. It was a small shark. So we dissected the shark to see what was inside its stomach. And I was amazed, inside a stomach that really wasn't very large at all, there were a bunch of items that clearly weren't going to decompose, and they weren't going to get through the small sphincter, the small hole at the end of the stomach, to get through his intestine and out of the shark. So they were accumulating in the stomach of the shark. Pieces of plastic, bobbins for the little bobbers that you hold up the hooks for fishing. He had all sorts of things in there that were never going to decompose. And it was clear that that was compromising the shark's ability to, in fact, eat things. Maybe you don't care about sharks, but the idea here is that organisms in general are going to be accumulating these things in their bodies. Not necessarily a good thing at all. What do we do about these things? Well, one solution is to work at increasing the amount of recycling we do. Take those non-biodegradable substances, those things that biomatrix can't decompose, and rather than throw them into our landfills, we recycle them. We remelt our plastics and make new plastics out of it. This will decrease the amount that's actually tossed into landfills. Another possibility is to replace our non-biodegradable materials with biodegradable materials. In other words, those defined as substances that the biomatrix can actually break down. And we're beginning to develop biodegradable plastics. This would be the appropriate way to proceed. Also, perhaps we can find biomatrix organisms that can break these things down. We have actually discovered organisms that break down oil, for example. And if we have an oil spill, we can introduce that organism into the oil spill, and he eats the oil for us and cleans up the oil. We've actually discovered a couple of plastic decomposing fungi discovered in the tropics of South America. This is cool. Maybe we can figure out a way to put these plastic-eating fungi into landfills to break up our fungi. There's several solutions we can work on to deal with non-biodegradable trash. Also, we have created not just trash, things we throw away that are non-biodegradable, but there's other things that we have produced that are non-biodegradable that we throw around in the world about us. For example, many of our herbicides, fungicides, insecticides are actually non-biodegradable. We've created them artificially in order to control insects and control fungi and so on and so forth. And we usually, in producing them, have never thought about, well, maybe I should make this in such a way that it can be decomposed in the natural environment. Usually we just want to control mosquitoes, or we want to control the weeds in a field, and we don't think about, should we let that stuff just sit there forever if it's not decomposable? And this has caused problems. For example, the most famous example is diphenyl trichloroethane. Now, fortunately, we don't always call it that. We take an acronym here, DDT. We have produced DDT for the purpose of controlling mosquitoes. It kills mosquitoes. Mosquitoes that carry malaria. So we've actually done this in countries where malaria is a real problem. We've spread DDT. We've sprayed areas with DDT to kill the mosquitoes so that malaria doesn't spread. As a result of the use of DDT, millions of people have been saved from death and serious illness because of malaria. But the problem is that dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, DDT, is in fact non-biodegradable. There's nothing that breaks it down. Once you've thrown it into the environment, there's no organism designed to break it down or to make it unpoisonous. It was invented as an insecticide, but it began to be observed that the higher predators in these water systems, of course mosquitoes grow in water, they're developed in water, so this is sprayed over water areas. The highest predators in these water areas were ospreys. The ospreys, it turns out, were bioaccumulators of DDT. And the consequence of this started to show up when ospreys that were laying eggs that had really, really thin shells. And the shells were so thin that they'd lay the egg, they'd break, and the little baby ospreys would be dead. So people were very concerned about the fact that the ospreys in these areas were dwindling in numbers. They weren't able to reproduce, to produce new offspring, or at least have babies that grew up to adults. And so there began to be concern about this. DDT was ultimately banned. It was banned internationally, and people stopped using it because of the damage it was doing to ospreys. Now, keep in mind, although that's, pretty good on one side, it's a good thing, to stop the use of DDT has led to the spread of malaria and the death of millions of people as a consequence. Okay, is it appropriate to allow millions of people to die to preserve the osprey? I would suggest that's the wrong way to do this. We need another kind of approach to the solution, to the problem. We have a problem. It's good that people tried to solve it, but you don't solve it by killing off humans to save animals. You try to avoid killing anything, but if you have to kill something, you kill animals to save humans, not the other way around. Comes to heavy metal mining, we've got yet another example of pollution. In this particular case, what we're talking about is mining things that involve what we call the heavy metals. Usually there's a bunch of things associated with the heavy metals that when you bring the heavy metals up to the surface, the other things kind of fall out on the ground. Those things are often quite poisonous. The things associated with heavy metals and heavy metals are destructive to life. A classic example is Ducktown, Tennessee. Mining of heavy metals in Ducktown resulted in that general area, hundreds of square miles, completely destroyed of life. Killed the plants, the animals, everything in a huge area. Complete devastation because the heavy metals were just simply poisonous. What has happened subsequent to this is interesting. Over the years, and it's been now decades since they stopped the heavy metal mining, we've discovered that there are some biomatrix organisms which are gradually restoring this particular area to fertility again, and plants are coming back and animals are coming back. But it's taken many decades to do. We took too many heavy metals out too quickly and weren't careful about what spilled, and as a consequence, we destroyed the environment. We need to be careful about our heavy metal mining. In addition to preserving the plant's biomatrix, we should be enhancing the biomatrix as well. This is kind of cool because I've already mentioned the fact that we did discover a fungus that actually breaks down plastic in South America, which is very encouraging. Perhaps there are other examples of this sort of thing. In fact, 1975, we discovered a type of bacteria, Flavobacterium, that actually breaks down some of the products that are used to produce nylon, or some of the products that are the byproducts of nylon. That's really cool because nylon is one of those non-biodegradable products. Perhaps this organism or others that we discover can be used to break down nylon. In 2010, 2012, we actually found some bacteria that can break down DDT and DDE, which is a natural breakdown product of DDT. That's pretty cool because maybe we can use that, mix that with our DDT, go back to spreading DDT, but with these DDT decomposing organisms, it allows the DDT to do its job of taking care of the malaria spreading mosquitoes, but the Biomatrix organisms will then break down the DDT after a bit of time and not have it do any damage in the environment. That's very encouraging. The plastic decomposing fungi from the Amazon encourages us to think that there might be organisms out there that God has designed to break down plastics. Which brings up a really interesting question. Why is it that there are organisms in the planet that can break down plastic? Why is it that there are organisms on the planet that can break down DDT or that can break down nylon? It's almost like somebody knew ahead of time that we were going to produce nylon and plastics and DDT, and that someone put Biomatrix organisms into the world for that moment when we would discover it, when we generate it. That's pretty cool. That's talking about God having thought ahead of time about the things that we would create and introducing organisms into the environment at the creation that would be ready to take care of the trash that we produce so many years later. That also suggests, and so although that's a little bit surprising, I think it's understandable that God would have done something like that. And if He did, there's probably a lot more of those out there. We should be searching for the organisms that God has created to take care of, to remediate the stuff that we produce that has never existed before in the history of the earth. We have this incredible God who anticipated our needs, who anticipated even the trash that we would produce. And He's created a world that can take care of it. We need to look for those designs in the world, those organisms, and use them to take care of the pollution, to remediate the poisons that we've introduced into the environment, and truly allow this incredible world to show better the very nature of God in those things that are made.